Since YouTube isn't currently providing any revenue for these videos, Patreon is the only way I can keep this channel going. Support me there to help improve the content quality so I can bring you even more intense stories. Click the link in the description to join me on this journey and help us survive the apocalypse. Let's get straight into the story. The first thing nobody tells you about preparing for the end of the world is how normal everything still looks while you're doing it. I'm standing in the cereal aisle of a Walmart at 6 in the morning, 3 weeks before the city goes dark for good. And I'm reading the back of an oatmeal canister like I'm writing a dissertation. Calculating calories per serving, calculating how many servings per person per day, calculating how many days I need to cover. The fluorescent lights are buzzing. Some kid in a blue vest is stocking shelves 2 aisles over and whistling something off-key. The whole place smells like floor cleaner and day-old donuts from the bakery section near the entrance. And I'm buying 40 pounds of oatmeal because the news out of Georgia is starting to look real. My name's Ray Kowalski, 46 years old. I drive a Peterbilt 579 for a regional freight company out of Columbus, Ohio. Been doing it for 19 years. Before that, I drove flatbeds. Before that, I drove a box truck for a moving company when I was 22 and too dumb to know what I wanted. I know trucks. I know how they move, what they weigh, how much fuel they burn per mile at highway speed versus city driving versus idling. I know loading docks and weigh stations and the kinds of roads that'll eat your axles if you push them wrong. I'm not a prepper. I want to be clear about that. I never stockpiled canned goods because of government collapse theories. Never built a bunker. Never bought one of those freeze-dried meal kits that taste like cardboard soaked in salt water. I'm a regular guy who drinks too much cheap coffee and watches football on Sundays and clips coupons because fuel costs keep going up and my pay hasn't kept pace. But I've been watching the news out of Atlanta for 11 days and something in my gut, the same gut that's been keeping me alive on I-70 through blizzards and black ice for nearly 2 decades. That gut is telling me this is real. So I'm buying oatmeal at 6 in the morning and doing math in my head. Let me back up. Day 1 of me actually believing it was a Thursday. Not the first day the news broke, which was about 2 weeks before that. The news broke on a Wednesday, and I remember because I was doing a long haul to Indianapolis and I had the radio on. And the AM station I usually pick up near the state line started running a story about some kind of quarantine situation in a suburb of Atlanta. Viral outbreak. Aggressive behavior in infected individuals. Biting. That was the word they used. Biting. I thought it was a hoax. I genuinely did. I know how the internet works. I know how rumors spread. I've been on the road enough years that I've heard every kind of crazy thing come through a truck radio. Stories about military convoys, stories about mass graves, stories that turned out to be nothing. This sounded like nothing. Aggressive virus, biting behavior, sounded like a bad rabies case blown out of proportion by someone with too much Twitter access. I got to Indianapolis, offloaded my freight at a distribution warehouse on the east side, filled up at a Love's truck stop, grabbed a hot dog off the roller grill that I knew I shouldn't eat, and drove home. Didn't think about it again for 5 days. The 5 days that followed were normal. I did a short run to Dayton, watched the game on Sunday, called my brother Kevin in Pittsburgh, who I talk to every couple of weeks. Kevin didn't mention anything about Georgia. My neighbor Glenn didn't mention anything. The guys at work didn't mention anything except that diesel prices were up again, which they always are. Then Thursday came. I was home that day, which I am about 3 days a week depending on scheduling. I was watching morning news with coffee. Bad habit, I know. Watching news in the morning ruins your whole day. And they had a live correspondent on the ground outside Atlanta, and the footage behind her was wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. The footage was wrong. There were emergency vehicles, which you'd expect. There was a National Guard presence, which you'd expect for something serious. But there were also people on the ground. Not protesters. Not riots exactly. Just people on the ground and other people. You could barely make them out in the long-shot camera footage. Just kind of standing there in ways that looked wrong. Standing too close. Moving without urgency. The correspondent was calm, but her voice had that thin quality that voices get when someone is holding themselves together with effort. I put my coffee down. I watched for 20 minutes without moving. Then I called my brother Kevin, who has a habit of being paranoid about everything and therefore knows more about emergency preparedness than anyone I've ever met. Kevin picked up on the second ring. I said, "You watching the news?" He said, "I've been watching it since Monday." And that was it, really. That was the moment my gut locked in and said, "This is real." Kevin didn't have useful information about what was happening in Georgia specifically. What he had was a framework I'd heard him talk about for years, but never taken seriously. What to do when infrastructure starts breaking down. What supplies actually matter versus what people panic buy. How long canned goods actually last versus what the label says. How to assess a location for defensibility. He'd spent the better part of a decade reading about disasters, studying historical accounts of what went wrong in emergency situations, memorizing information he assumed he'd never need. He needed it now. We both did. Kevin was in Pittsburgh. I was in Columbus. We agreed we'd keep each other updated. We agreed that if things looked like they were moving beyond Georgia, we'd figure out a plan. That was day one of me believing it. Then I spent the next 3 days watching and not yet doing, which is a mistake I won't make again if I ever get to do any of this over. 3 days of watching the news get worse, watching the confirmed area expand, watching the language from official sources shift from outbreak to containment situation to developing situation. That progression of increasingly vague language that means the people who are supposed to know things have stopped knowing things. On the 4th day, I got up at 5 in the morning and started making a list. I should explain where I live, because it matters for everything that came after. I rent a house in a neighborhood called Glenbrook on the east side of Columbus. It's not a fancy neighborhood. Working class mostly. Modest houses, smallish yards, streets close together. My house is a 2-story from the 1970s with a detached garage that I use for storage and truck maintenance. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths. The basement is unfinished, concrete floor, exposed pipes overhead, 1 small window at ground level on the east-facing wall. The backyard has a 6-foot privacy fence that the previous owner put up, which I've always appreciated for the quiet, but now appreciate for different reasons. I live alone. I was married, divorced 8 years ago. No kids. My closest family is Kevin in Pittsburgh, 4 hours east. I have a sister, Dana, who lives in Denver with her husband and their 2 daughters. I have my parents out in Westerville, which is about 20 minutes north of me. But they're both in their mid-70s, and my dad has a bad hip. My mom has the kind of arthritis that makes stairs a problem. I thought about them constantly through all of this. I still do. The neighborhood has maybe 60 houses within 2 blocks of me. I know maybe a dozen of those neighbors well enough to wave at. 3 of them I know by name. Glenn next door, a retired electrician who is about 65 and keeps his yard like a military installation. Mrs. Petrova across the street, who is 80-something and speaks maybe 40 words of English, but always brings me food at Christmas. And Todd, 2 houses down, who works at a car dealership and has a bass boat in his driveway that he takes out maybe twice a year. That's it. That's my world. And I had to figure out how to protect it. The list I made that first morning was messy. I wrote it on the back of an old shipping manifest I had in the kitchen junk drawer, and I wrote fast because writing fast kept me from second-guessing every line. The categories were food, water, medical, tools, defense, communication, power. Under food I wrote canned goods, dry goods, protein, canned meat, dried beans, cooking supplies, salt, sugar, oil, vitamins. Under water I wrote stored water, filtration, collection. Under medical I wrote first aid, antibiotics if possible, prescription refills for anything I take. Pain management. Under tools I wrote hand tools, cutting tools, fire making, rope and cordage. Under defense I wrote nothing yet. I had to think about defense. Under communication I wrote battery radio, hand crank radio, batteries, backup phone charger. Under power I wrote generator if possible, fuel storage, candles, headlamps, lanterns. Then I sat and stared at the list for a while and thought about money. I had about $4,000 in my checking account and maybe another $800 in savings that I keep for emergencies. Total, not much. Less than most people think you'd need to prepare for something like this, but more than zero, which is what a lot of people were working with. I did the math on what was absolutely essential versus what was nice to have. I called Kevin again and asked him to walk me through priorities. Kevin said, water first, always. You can survive weeks without food. You die in 3 days without water. After water, calories, dense, non-perishable, low preparation. After that, medical, because infections and injuries become lethal when hospitals stop working. Everything else is secondary until you have those 3 covered. So I started with water. The water situation took me 2 days to figure out properly. Here's what I ended up doing. The first thing was, I went to Home Depot and bought a 50-gallon water barrel, the kind they sell for rain collection. Cost me about $30. I filled it from the tap in the basement and added a water preservation tablet. That's 50 gallons right there. Then I bought 6 7-gallon water containers, the kind that look like blue jugs, from a camping supply store. Filled those too. Another 42 gallons. Then I thought harder and realized that if water mains go down or get contaminated, I need a way to keep collecting. I bought a basic portable water filtration system, a Sawyer squeeze, which Kevin had recommended, and 2 Berkey water filter replacements that I already had somewhere in the garage from a camping trip I took years ago and never finished. A Berkey works on gravity. You put dirty water in the top chamber and clean water comes out the bottom. It's slow, but it works without electricity or chemicals. I also bought 300 water purification tablets. Cheap insurance. Total water capacity if I used everything. Roughly 100 gallons stored, plus ongoing collection and filtration if rain came or I found additional sources. For one person, that's about a 2-month supply for drinking and cooking with some rationing. If I needed to wash, I'd be careful. If I needed to flush the toilet, I'd figure that out separately. 2 days, water covered. I felt better. Then food. The food shopping is where I made mistakes. And I want to be honest about the mistakes because they cost me later. My first mistake was buying a lot of things I don't normally eat just because they're shelf-stable. I bought 6 cans of hominy, for example. I have eaten hominy exactly once in my life and did not enjoy it. I bought it because it was there and it said long shelf life, and my brain was in acquisition mode. Same with a bunch of canned beets. Not one single beet entered my mouth in the 6 months leading up to this, and yet there I was putting 6 cans in the cart. The rule I should have followed, which Kevin told me afterward, and which I will burn into my brain permanently, is this: buy what you actually eat, just more of it. Rotating stock. If you normally eat rice, buy 100 pounds of rice and rotate through it. If you normally eat canned soup, buy 50 cans of canned soup. Don't buy survival food you've never cooked. You'll have enough stress without also fighting your own appetite. But I didn't know that fully yet, so I bought a mix of things I'd actually eat and things I thought were smart survival food. What I ended up with, after 3 separate grocery runs over about 5 days: about 60 pounds of rice, stored in airtight 5-gallon buckets I bought at the hardware store. Rice stores for years if you keep moisture and pests out. 40 pounds of dry pinto beans, same storage method. Beans are dense protein. Combined with rice, you get a complete amino acid profile, which matters when you're not getting variety from other sources. 40 pounds of oatmeal. Good breakfast, decent calories, stores well. Around 200 cans of various things: soup, chili, canned chicken, canned tuna, canned salmon, canned vegetables, corn, green beans, peas, tomatoes, canned fruit, canned beans of multiple varieties, canned pasta and sauce. I tried to keep variety so I wasn't eating the exact same thing every day. 12 pounds of pasta, 10 pounds of all-purpose flour, 8 pounds of sugar, 5 pounds of salt, 4 liters of vegetable oil, 3 large containers of peanut butter. Peanut butter is one of the best survival foods there is. High calorie, shelf stable, no cooking required, actually palatable. 2 cases of crackers. A bunch of honey, because honey literally doesn't expire. Multivitamins, enough for a year, which seemed excessive at the time and does not seem excessive now. Coffee, obviously coffee. I bought 4 large cans of ground coffee, and I'm not apologizing for it. If I'm surviving the end of the world, I'm doing it caffeinated. Tea, a big box of tea bags. Spices. This was Kevin's suggestion, and it was a good one. Cumin, garlic powder, chili powder, paprika, oregano, black pepper. Spices weigh nothing, and they make rice and beans not taste like sadness. All of this went into the basement. I organized it by category along the concrete wall opposite the stairs. I made a rough inventory list and taped it to the wall so I could check things off as I used them. Total cost for the food: about $800 over the course of the shopping runs. I spread it out partly because I didn't want to spend it all at once, and partly because I was still not 100% certain this was real. And part of my brain was still maintaining the possibility that I was overreacting and would end up with a very well-stocked basement and nothing to show for it. That part of my brain went quiet around day 12, when the news out of Georgia stopped being containable as a local situation, and they reported confirmed cases in Alabama, Tennessee, and South Carolina. Let me tell you about the truck. The truck I drive for work is a company rig. I don't own it, I just run it. But I do own a vehicle of my own, a 2016 Ram, a 2500, diesel, crew cab, long bed. I bought it used 3 years ago with high miles because I got it cheap and I know how to maintain it. It's got a 6.7-liter Cummins engine that'll run forever if you treat it right. And it gets decent fuel economy for a truck that size. The bed is useful. The tow capacity is useful. The 4-wheel drive is useful. On day 8 of my preparation, I drove to a U-Haul equipment rental place and bought 2 2 extra 55-gallon fuel drums that they had in the back for sale. Cost me about $70 each. I strapped them in the truck bed and drove to a diesel fuel supplier on the east side of town and filled both barrels. That's 110 gallons of diesel fuel sitting in my truck bed, plus the 60-gallon main tank that I kept topped off. Total diesel, about 170 gallons. The Ram gets roughly 16 miles per gallon on the highway, a bit less in town. That's roughly 2,000 miles of range. I didn't know where I'd need to go or how far, but 2,000 miles in reserve felt like something rather than nothing. I also bought a hand pump for the barrels so I could transfer fuel without electricity, which turned out to be one of the better investments I made in those 30 days. The truck stayed in the garage with the garage locked. I added a padlock to the garage door from the inside as a backup. Defense. I have to talk about defense. Here's the honest situation. I don't own a gun. Never have. I'm not philosophically opposed to them. I just never got around to getting one, and I live alone in a working-class neighborhood in Ohio, and it never felt necessary. Now I was standing in my kitchen in week 2 of preparing for what was looking more and more like a zombie apocalypse, thinking, I probably need a gun. The problem is that getting a gun properly, especially in Ohio, takes time I wasn't sure I had. You have to go through a licensed dealer, background check, some waiting. And even if that all went smoothly, I didn't know how to shoot with any real competence beyond the 1 or 2 times I'd been to ranges with friends over the years. So I made a different call. I went to a sporting goods store and I bought a compound bow and 200 arrows. This sounds stupid when you say it out loud, but hear me out. A bow doesn't make noise. A gunshot makes noise. Noise is the one thing I needed to avoid more than anything else. Because if the situation in Georgia was anything to go by, noise attracted infected people the way food attracts flies. I wasn't planning to fight armies of them. I was planning to stay quiet and survive. But if something came into my space and I needed to deal with it without bringing every other infected in the neighborhood, a bow made more sense than a rifle. I also bought a high-carbon steel machete with a 22-inch blade and a good leather sheath, and a hatchet, and 2 hunting knives of different sizes. And I spent 3 evenings in my backyard shooting the compound bow at a foam target I set up against the back fence. I'm not a bad shot. By the end of the 3rd evening, I could reliably hit center mass on a stationary target at 20 yards. Good enough for something walking slowly toward me. Kevin, when I told him about the bow decision, paused for a few seconds and then said, "That's actually not stupid," which from Kevin counts as high praise. I reinforced the house in stages. I put deadbolts on both the front and back exterior doors. The back door only had a basic knob lock before, which was embarrassing in retrospect. I put long screws into all the existing door frame hardware, replacing the standard 1/2-inch screws with 3-inch screws that go deep into the wall studs. This makes a huge difference in how much force a door can resist. I watched a YouTube video about it and spent about 4 hours going through every exterior door in the house. The windows worried me more than the doors. A window can be broken. I bought rolls of plywood cut to window size and stacked them in the basement, along with a drill, screws, and a reciprocating saw. I didn't board everything up immediately because I wanted to keep visibility and light as long as possible. But I had the materials ready to go. The basement window, the small one at ground level on the east side, I blocked from inside with a piece of 1/2-inch plywood and 4 screws. That window was too small for a person to crawl through, but it was the most vulnerable point, being at ground level. And I didn't want the question. Day 14. 2 weeks in on my prep. 2 weeks before everything went sideways. I called my parents. This was a conversation I'd been avoiding because I knew how it was going to go, and I was right. My dad picked up, and I asked him what he'd heard about the situation in Georgia, and he said it was overblown, and the media was making it dramatic and probably some kind of manufactured thing. He said it during the 2020 pandemic. He said it about bird flu, and he was going to say it about this. My dad is a reasonable man in most respects, but he has a profound distrust of emergency situations that he didn't personally verify with his own eyes. And at 74, that worldview is not changing. My mom listened in on the extension. She always does. She asked me if I was eating okay. I tried to explain. I told them I was stocking up, and I thought they should do the same. I offered to come out to Westerville and bring them supplies, which is only 20 minutes away. My dad said that wasn't necessary. My mom asked if I had a girlfriend. I gave up and told them I'd check in every few days, and if things started looking worse, I'd come get them. I called Dana in Denver after. She'd been paying attention to the news and was taking it seriously. Her husband, Craig, is a former Marine and had already started doing similar things to what I was doing. They were in a suburban neighborhood outside Denver, solidly stocked, and Craig had weapons and knew how to use them. I felt better about Dana. Kevin and I talked every 2 days. Kevin was locked in tight in Pittsburgh. His neighborhood was quiet. He'd been preparing for years in a background sort of way, keeping 3 months of food on hand always, maintaining an emergency kit, that kind of thing. He had a good setup. We talked about whether to meet up somewhere, consolidate, 2 people being harder to kill than 1. We decided not to yet. Traveling before things broke down seemed like unnecessary risk. If things got bad enough that staying put wasn't viable, we'd figure out the route. Day 16. The news shifted in a way that made my stomach drop. They stopped calling them infected. Not officially. Officially, they were still saying individuals exhibiting aggressive behaviors consistent with a neurological condition. But on social media, which was running about 3 days ahead of official reporting, people were using the word. Everyone was using the word. The word nobody wants to say because it sounds insane. I said it out loud, alone in my kitchen with my coffee at 6 in the morning. Zombies. It felt ridiculous. It also felt accurate. The thing is, I grew up on zombie movies. George Romero, Dawn of the Dead, 28 Days Later, the whole World War Z book. The Max Brooks one, not the movie. The movie is different. I'd watched enough of them, read enough of the zombie fiction, that I had a rough functional understanding of how this kind of situation tended to go. And the news footage I was watching matched up in ways that were hard to explain any other way. Slow moving for the most part, drawn to sound, not communicating, not coordinating, not thinking, just moving toward noise and trying to bite. Biting was transmission. You get bitten, you become one of them. Standard Romero rules, more or less. I didn't know the exact biology. I still don't. What I knew was what they did and how to not become one of them, and I treated that as the operating model. Kevin had a useful mental framework for this that I borrowed. He called it operational simplicity. When everything is uncertain, focus on what you can verify through direct observation, not on what experts say or what official sources claim. The one observable fact was, something was spreading. People were dying or changing or both. And the infected were attacking the uninfected. Everything else was noise. Operate on what you can verify. Everything else is noise. Day 18. I drove out to Westerville to see my parents. My dad still didn't believe it was serious, but he'd noticed I was serious, and he'd gotten quiet about it. Which is how my dad shows that he's taking something in. My mom made soup, which she does when she's worried. We sat at the kitchen table, and I went through what I thought was coming and what they should do. Their house is a ranch. 1 story, 3 bedrooms, good basement. The basement in a ranch is actually better defensively than in a 2-story because the infected don't navigate obstacles well, and a basement with good reinforcement and minimal windows is about as safe as you can get without going underground. I spent 4 hours at their house that day doing things. I put better locks on the doors. I carried the supplies I'd brought. 3 boxes of food, 2 cases of water bottles, a hand crank, a radio, a first aid kit. Down to their basement and organized them against the wall. I wrote my phone number on a piece of paper and taped it to the basement wall, even though they obviously know my number. I made a list of what to do if things went bad and taped that up too. My dad didn't say much while I worked. Near the end, he came down to the basement and stood there looking at the supplies I'd put up, and then he looked at me and he said, "Ray, you really think it's coming here?" It wasn't a question. He was just looking for me to confirm what his gut was already telling him. I said, "Yeah, I think it's coming here." He nodded. He asked what they should do if they needed to leave the house. I told him, "Don't. Stay in the basement. You'll know when it's time to come out because it'll go quiet. Wait for quiet. Don't try to drive anywhere unless I tell you it's safe. I'll call. If phones go down, I'll come to you." He said, "Okay." My mom hugged me for a long time in the kitchen before I left. Day 20. News was now reporting confirmed cases in 6 states. The Army National Guard was deployed in 3 of them. The term federal emergency got used and then retracted and then used again. Social media was a full meltdown. Half conspiracy theory, half genuine terror. Hard to separate one from the other. I stopped looking at social media except to extract specific geographic information about where things were being reported. I had a map of Ohio and the surrounding states taped to my kitchen wall, and I was marking it with a red marker. The red was moving north. I finished the basement fortifications. The plywood for the windows was pre-cut and stored next to the wall. The water was stored. The food was stored and organized. I'd made a second inventory list and updated it after a full audit of everything I had. I set up a sleeping area in the basement. I pulled my camping gear out of the garage. Sleeping pad, sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees, 2 battery-powered lanterns, a propane camp stove with 8 canisters of fuel. This would be my living space if the house became compromised upstairs. The basement door at the top of the stairs had a solid bolt lock which I'd reinforced the same way I'd done the exterior doors. The basement door was now about as secure as a door in a house can get without it being an actual vault door. I tested the camp stove in the backyard first. I wanted to make sure it worked and that I understood the fuel situation. 8 canisters at about an hour of cooking time per canister, rationed carefully, was enough for months. I wrote my inventory on a spreadsheet on my phone and kept it updated. Total calories stored. Somewhere around 1.8 million if I did the math right. For one person eating about 1,800 calories per day, that was about 1,000 days. Almost 3 years. I sat with that number for a while. 3 years. If I ate alone and didn't share and didn't waste anything. 3 years. Kevin said, "That's the right number. You want more than you think you need. You're going to share. You're going to have waste. You're going to have spoilage. Aim for excess and you'll land at enough. Day 22. I did something I hadn't done yet, and that I was embarrassed to have put off. I talked to Glenn next door. Glenn is retired, 65, widower, keeps to himself, but in a friendly way. He's the kind of neighbor who watches your house while you're away without being asked, and doesn't need to be thanked. I'd seen him a few times in the past 3 weeks, but I'd been so focused on my own prep that I hadn't stopped to think about what he was or wasn't doing. I went over to his place in the evening. He was on the back porch having a beer, which is something Glenn does on warm evenings. We talked for a while about nothing, and then I asked him what he thought about the situation. He said he'd been following it. He said his daughter out in Michigan had called him 3 times that week. He said he wasn't sure what to make of it, but he wasn't sleeping great. I told him what I'd been doing. Told him about the food, the water, the reinforcements. Told him my best assessment of how serious this was. I told him I thought within the next 1 to 2 weeks, things in Columbus were going to get bad. He listened. Glenn doesn't interrupt. He sat there with his beer and listened to all of it, and then he said, "What do I need?" So I walked him through it. I drove him to Walmart the next morning and helped him shop. I bought things for him out of my own pocket for the stuff he wouldn't have thought of. Water purification tablets, the good first aid supplies, a hand crank radio. He paid for the food. His basement had good storage already, better than mine actually, old shelving his wife had put in years ago for canning. We spent a day together getting his basement in order, and I reinforced his back door while I was there. I showed him the wood for window boarding, which he already had in his garage from a storm project. Glenn said near the end of that day that he'd lived through a lot of things in his life, and he thought he'd seen everything. He said this in a quiet way that wasn't dramatic. Just a statement. I said, yeah. Me too. Kinda. Day 24. The news came out of Indianapolis. Indianapolis is about 2.5 hours southwest of Columbus, on I-70. Confirmed cases. Official language. A small number of cases consistent with what's been observed elsewhere. My red marker went on the map. The red was no longer moving toward me. It had arrived at the border. I called Kevin. He was following it. His assessment, the virus, or whatever it was, had a roughly 2-week acceleration pattern in any given metro area. 2 weeks from first confirmed case to widespread infection. Was the model he was using based on what had happened in the cities that were further along. 2 weeks from the first case, showing up in a place the size of Indianapolis, meant Indianapolis would be fully compromised around November. Columbus. Probably similar timeline once it arrived. I had maybe 2 weeks before I needed to be fully inside. I started the serious fortifications. The ground floor windows. I boarded 8 of them. Not all of them. I left the second floor windows clear for light and visibility. And I left one downstairs window unboarded, but covered with a dark plastic sheet so I could move the sheet and look out without being visible from outside. The front door had already been reinforced. I added a horizontal bar bracket behind it. 2 brackets, bolted into studs on both sides of the door frame with a 2x4 drop bar. That door would resist a serious amount of force. The garage door was the weak point. Garage doors are not strong. Mine is a standard rolling door, and a determined person or a serious crowd of anything could push through it. I reinforced it from the inside with a series of 2x4s braced against the concrete floor, creating a rudimentary but effective barricade. I pulled the ram inside the garage before doing this, so it was parked in, secure, ready. I set up a basic alert system along the fence line. Fishing line strung at ankle height along the back fence connected to a series of empty cans that would rattle if something tripped it. Crude, extremely effective at waking you up at 3 in the morning. I'd know if anything moved along the back fence before it got close to the house. Day 25. I checked on my parents again. Phone call. I didn't want to drive unnecessarily. They were okay. My dad sounded different from how he'd sounded before. Quieter. He'd been watching the news more. He said, "The boy in Indianapolis. Did you see about the boy?" He'd seen a video clip of something on the news, and I could tell from his voice that the doubt had left him. Whatever he'd seen in that clip had done what all the words and reporting before it hadn't managed. He said, "We'll be in the basement." I said, "Good." I said I'd check on them every day as long as the phones worked. My mom got on the line and told me she loved me. I told her I loved her too. We don't say that often. My family's not a big "I love you" family in the regular way. We show it in showing up, in fixing the door, in sitting at the table. But that day she said it and meant it, and I said it back and meant it. That was the last phone call I had with her that wasn't strained with worry. Day 27. 3 days out. I know it was 3 days because the first confirmed case in Franklin County, which is the county Columbus sits in, was reported 3 days later. And day 27 was the last normal day I can really describe. The last day the neighborhood still looked and sounded like a neighborhood. I spent that day doing final checks. I went through the inventory again. I checked the water containers, checked all the seals, added fresh purification tablets to everything. I charged every battery-operated device I owned. I bought 2 more cases of AA batteries and a case of D-cell batteries. I was using AA headlamps and D-cell in the lanterns. I tested the camp stove one final time and stored it with everything else in the basement. I tested the bow in the backyard one last time. Shot 20 arrows at the foam target at varying distances. My accuracy at 30 yards was good enough. At 40, it got sketchy. I filed that away as a maximum engagement distance and didn't push it. I pulled my truck out of the garage and went on one final supply run. I drove carefully to a hardware store and bought a large roll of heavy plastic sheeting, duct tape, more wood screws, a second hatchet because redundancy is always smart, and a small handheld metal detector I found in the clearance aisle that I bought on impulse because I had $20 left, and it seemed like the kind of thing that might matter for reasons I couldn't articulate. The hardware store was unusual. The staff was there but distracted. There was a radio on somewhere in the back playing news, and you could see the 2 people at the registers listening to it when they didn't think anyone was watching. A couple of other customers were doing the same kind of loading up shopping I was doing. Nobody said anything to each other. We moved around the aisles with a specific kind of focused silence. At the register, the woman who rang me up, middle-aged, reading glasses, name tag said Karen, looked at my cart and then looked at me and said, "You're ready, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah, I thought so." She said, "I'm not. My husband says I'm being dramatic." She paused and ran the hatchet over the scanner. "He works nights. He'll come home tonight and everything will be fine." I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to tell her to go home and fill her bathtub with water and lock the doors and not leave. I wanted to say a lot of things. I said, "I hope he's right." She handed me my receipt. She said, "Me too. I think about her sometimes. Karen from the hardware store. I hope she got to do what she needed to do before it got bad." Day 28. Columbus had its first confirmed case. My red marker on the map. I called Kevin. Kevin said, 2 weeks, maybe less, given how saturated the surrounding areas were already. He said, don't count on 2 weeks. He said, act like it's 2 days. I did. I pulled the boards for the remaining unboarded ground floor windows and screwed them up. I left the observation gap, the single window with the plastic sheeting, because I needed eyes outside. I wired up the last of the can alert lines along the side fence that I hadn't gotten to yet. I filled a bucket in the basement bathroom and set it near the toilet as flush assist water. When water pressure dropped, I could use it to flush manually. I made a sign for the front door, white paper, big black letters, that just said, "Nothing here, not worth it." It sounds stupid, but there's a theory that looters, and potentially organized survivors, move past places that look already cleared. Worth trying. I tested every flashlight, every headlamp, every lantern. Inventoried batteries one more time. Stood in the basement in the dark with all lights off to see what zero light looked like and how long I'd need to find a headlamp by feel. 30 seconds if I knew exactly where it was. I practiced 3 times. Then I memorized the exact spot. That night I slept upstairs in my own bed for what I assumed would be the last time in a while. I lay there listening to the neighborhood. A dog barking 2 streets over. A car passing. Wind in the big oak in Mrs. Petrova's yard across the street. Normal sounds. I thought about normal things. I thought about a rest stop on I-75 near Dayton that has a particularly good vending machine and a clean bathroom. I thought about the coffee at the Flying J in Effingham, Illinois, which is actually decent if you catch it right after they brew it. I thought about driving at night. That specific quality of highway at 2 in the morning when it's just you and your rig and the white line in the dark on both sides. I fell asleep. Day 29 was when the first thing happened in my neighborhood specifically. I heard it before I saw it. I was in the kitchen in the morning on my second coffee when I heard a sound from the direction of Mrs. Petrova's house across the street. A kind of shouting that was wrong. The vowels distorted in a way that was neither pain nor anger, but some combination of both that had no good name. I went to my observation window, the covered one on the front of the house, and peeled back the plastic sheeting. Mrs. Petrova was in her front yard. Something was wrong with her. She was in her housecoat, which wasn't unusual for morning, but she was moving in a slow circle in the middle of her yard, arms at her sides, head at an angle. The shouting sound I'd heard had stopped. She was silent now, just moving in that slow circle. I stood there for about 30 seconds watching. Then a neighbor from down the block, a young guy, maybe mid-20s, I didn't know him, came around the corner walking his dog, and he saw Mrs. Petrova and stopped. He called out to her. She turned toward the sound, and I watched her close the distance between them at that stumbling walk that I'd only seen before, on news footage and in movies. The dog started screaming. Dogs make a specific sound when they're truly terrified, a sound nothing else makes, a high sustained note that cuts right through you. The young guy yanked the leash and backpedaled. Mrs. Petrova reached the dog before the man could pull it away, and she went down on her knees in the grass, and the dog was still making that sound. I didn't watch the rest. I dropped the plastic sheeting and stepped back from the window. I had been expecting this. I had been preparing for this for 29 days. I had done everything right, done more right things than wrong. And yet standing in my kitchen with my second coffee going cold, I felt something cold wash through me that wasn't preparation at all. It was just plain terror, the simple animal fact of it. I took 3 breaths. I went downstairs. I turned off the lights and sat in the basement in the near dark with a headlamp on my head and the compound bow across my knees and the machete leaning against the wall, and I stayed there until the sounds outside stopped. That was day 29. Day 30. The last day on my count, which is a strange thing to call it. The last day. But it's the day everything I'd been building toward either mattered or didn't. I spent most of the morning listening. Sound carries differently when the ambient noise of a functioning neighborhood drops away. No traffic, no lawn mowers, no neighbors talking across fences, no school bus going by at 7:50. By mid-morning, the baseline sound of my street was just wind, and occasionally, from somewhere north, that wet vocal sound that I had heard on the news footage. Around noon, I heard something hit the front fence. Then silence. Then again. I put on my headlamp, picked up the bow, and went upstairs on the balls of my feet. I peeled the plastic sheeting back about an inch. There were 3 of them on my street. 2 moving westward in that slow, shuffling walk, heads dipping slightly with each step, following something, sound, smell, I don't know. One standing still against the chain-link fence of the house diagonally across from me. Both hands flat against the fence links, pressing and pressing and pressing. It wasn't climbing. It wasn't problem-solving. It was just pressing toward whatever was on the other side. Following an impulse it couldn't translate into action. I watched for a long time. None of them turned toward my house. The boarded windows meant no movement to see. The plywood absorbed sound differently than glass. The plastic sheeting over my observation window reduced whatever visual signature I might otherwise create. Around 3 in the afternoon, the number on my street had grown to maybe 12. They moved in loose clusters, occasionally bumping into each other with no reaction, just absorbing the contact and continuing in whatever direction they'd been going. No communication, no coordination, pure stimulus response. This confirmed what I'd been assuming. They don't work together in any meaningful way. They're not hunting as a group. They're just all individually following the same inputs, sound and movement. And that creates an appearance of coordinated behavior without any actual coordination. Understanding that is the difference between being completely terrified and only mostly terrified. If they're not coordinating, they're manageable. If they are, nothing you do matters anyway. One of them on the street stopped and turned its head in my direction. I held absolutely still, my hand on the plastic sheeting, not breathing, watching through the narrow gap. It stood that way for almost a full minute. Then it turned away and continued shuffling west. Not because I was clever, not because the boarded windows and covered observation gap were guaranteed to work. Just because there was no sound, nothing to follow. I was in a house that had gone quiet, and so to something that operated on sound and movement, I didn't exist. That lesson burned itself into the operational rules I started running by. Stay quiet, move slow, no sudden sounds, everything deliberate. Okay, that's the prep. 30 days compressed into whatever that was. Some of it feels like it happened to someone else when I try to describe it. Some of it is still crystal clear. The feel of the wood boards under my hands when I screwed them into the window frames. The exact smell of the basement. Concrete and cardboard and that slightly stale smell that basements have. The weight of Glenn's company when we were loading his shelves and not talking about what we were actually doing. Now let me tell you about what it was actually like. Day 32. 2 days after my count ended. The phone still worked. This surprised me. The cell network was degraded, calls dropping more, slower data, but it worked. I called my parents. They were in the basement. My dad sounded different again, smaller somehow. A man who has finally had to update his model of what the world can do. My mom cried a little, not dramatically. Just a few seconds of it, and then she pulled herself together and asked if I was eating. I said yes, I was. I called Kevin. Kevin's neighborhood in Pittsburgh was about 3 days behind mine, he estimated. He was buttoned up tight. We agreed to check in every 48 hours. If one of us missed 2 consecutive check-ins, the other would assume the worst and act accordingly. We didn't define what accordingly meant. Neither of us wanted to. Glenn knocked on the shared fence between our yards around noon, not with his hand. We'd agreed to use a specific knock pattern, 3 slow knocks and then 2 fast, to tell each other it was us before anything else. He knocked the pattern, and I went to the back window. He slid a note under the gap in the fence. The note said, "I have coffee maker. Do you have coffee?" I made a pot and stood at the fence, and we talked through the boards while we drank coffee on our respective sides. This became a daily thing. Glenn's voice through the fence planks, afternoon coffee, updates on what we'd each heard and seen. He'd seen 4 of them in his backyard the previous evening. They'd come in through the back gate, which he hadn't thought to lock because who thinks about locking their back gate? They'd bumped along the fence line and eventually found their way back out through the same gate. He'd watched through a gap in his boarded kitchen window. Hadn't slept after. I told him to lock the gate. He said he knew that now. Small things like that. The lessons you didn't think you'd need because they seemed obvious and turned out not to be obvious at all when you were actually doing them. Day 36. Phones went down. I'd been expecting it, but it still hit like a physical thing. I tried calling my parents 3 times, hitting the dead signal, and then I just sat with the phone in my hand for a while. Kevin, my parents, Dana in Denver, all of that cut off all at once. I turned on the hand crank radio, found an AM station still broadcasting, out of Columbus, WBNS. They were still operating on emergency generator power, skeleton crew, reading from official updates they were receiving from somewhere. The language was carefully measured and clearly trying not to cause panic in a situation where panic was honestly quite justified. But between the careful official language, you could read the actual information. The city was in a declared state of emergency. Residents were urged to shelter in place. Vital infrastructure, water treatment, power grid, was being maintained by essential personnel. As long as those people could hold on, I'd have running water and electricity. How long that lasted was anyone's guess. I wrote down the key frequencies in the back of a notebook I kept in the basement. That notebook became important. I wrote everything in it. What I heard on the radio, what I observed through the window, the date, approximate times, temperature. I had an indoor/outdoor thermometer. My food and water consumption that day. Every day got a page. Not because I thought someone would read it later. I wasn't being poetic about it. But because tracking things is how I stayed oriented. When everything outside stops making sense, you need something inside that does. Day 38. Power went out at 2 in the afternoon. It went the way power always goes. Lights, then the buzz of the refrigerator cutting out, then silence where there'd been the background hum of electricity running through a house. I already had headlamps and lanterns. I knew this was coming. But the silence that followed the power going off was a specific kind of silence that I hadn't prepared for emotionally. It was the sound of things ending. I lit a headlamp and did a circuit of the basement. Checked everything. Water barrels, food stores, camp stove. All fine. I moved the things that had been in the refrigerator into the basement. It was cool enough down there that some of it would keep for a few more days. I ate the things that wouldn't keep. A block of cheese, some lunch meat, 2 yogurts that were going to go bad regardless. Then I sat on my sleeping pad in the basement with a headlamp on the ground, pointing up at the ceiling, filling the space with diffuse light that was adequate but not warm. And I thought about what this meant in practical terms. No refrigerator meant no cold storage. That ruled out a whole category of food I'd been hoping to supplement with. Anything that needed cold. I had my canned goods, my rice and beans, my dry goods. That was the inventory now. Simple food, prepared on the camp stove. The first meal I cooked on the camp stove was canned chili heated directly in the can, which you can do carefully with a camp stove if you don't let it go too hot. It tasted like canned chili. Not bad. Not good. A meal. I ate alone by headlamp in the basement of my house, while outside the sounds that weren't supposed to be sounds mixed with the wind. I need to tell you about the first time I went outside after the power went. That was day 41, 3 days after the power went down. I needed water from the rain barrel I'd set up on the garage's east side. The Berkey filters were in the basement, but I had to transfer water from outside to inside. I'd known this would come up. I'd planned for it. The plan? Go out the back door, move along the fence line to the garage, fill 2 5-gallon jugs from the barrel's spigot, return the same way. Total exposed time. Roughly 3 to 4 minutes if I moved efficiently. What I wore? Dark clothes, a heavy denim work jacket with close-fitted collar. I wrapped a cloth around my neck and lower face. Not sophisticated. Just the cloth. Long work gloves. Work boots with good ankle coverage. The machete in my right hand. The hatchet through my belt loop. Compound bow on my back. I stood at the back door for about 2 minutes, listening. Nothing from the backyard. I cracked the door an inch, waited. Nothing. I went out. The air smelled bad in a way I didn't know how to categorize then, but I know now. It's the smell of a city that stopped maintaining itself. Dumpsters uncollected, burst pipes, the particular organic rot of things left in the warmth. It was October by this point, which helped. Cooler air kept some of it tamped down, but it was there. My backyard was clear. I moved to the garage wall, got to the barrel, worked the spigot as slow and quiet as I could. The water made a sound going into the jug. Low, but present. I worked slowly. The jugs filled. I heard something on the other side of the back fence. I stopped filling. Stood still. Something on the other side was pressing against the fence boards. I could hear it, the creak of the wood taking weight. Then the pressing stopped. Then it started again a few feet to the left, then stopped. I stood motionless with half a jug of water and the spigot open, dripping on my boot. I did not close the spigot. That would make noise. I waited. The pressing on the fence moved further left and then stopped. I counted to 60 in my head. Nothing. I closed the spigot, slowly, picked up the jugs, moved back to the door. Inside. Locked the door. Stood in the kitchen in the dark, breathing. My hands were completely steady. I noticed that. All the fear was in my chest and stomach, but my hands were steady, which surprised me. All that driving, all those years of managing big machines in bad weather, had apparently trained something in my body to stay functional even when my head was doing something else. I brought the water to the basement and ran it through the Berkey. Day 44. Glenn and I had coffee through the fence, but Glenn sounded off. He'd slept badly. He said he'd heard something in his basement during the night, and when he'd investigated, he'd found his old dog door, which he'd boarded up with just some duct tape and foam on day 20 of his prep, had partially come loose. Something had been trying to push through from outside. He'd found marks on the wood, gouging marks that were unmistakably handmade, and it had taken him until morning to get it fully resecured. I asked him if he'd seen what was outside when he was fixing it. He said no. He'd fixed it in the dark by feel because he hadn't wanted any light visible through the gap. I told him to use screws next time, not tape. He said he knew. He sounded shaken in a way that Glenn, steady, practical, 65-year-old Glenn with a military-grade yard, didn't usually sound. Shaken down to something underneath the competent outer layer. We drank coffee and talked about something else for a while. He told me about an elk hunting trip he'd taken years ago in Montana. I told him about a run I'd done through the Rocky Mountains once in February, when the weather had turned, and I'd had to chain up on E70 in a whiteout. We talked about normal things, and then we said goodbye, and I stood on my side of the fence for a while after he went in. Something changed around day 48. I don't know if I'd call it adjustment exactly. More like my brain stopped running the constant background process of this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, and started running something closer to this is how it is. That transition from emergency to baseline is strange when you notice it happening. I started having a daily rhythm, up with whatever light came through the cracks in the boards, early to mid. Morning, depending on the season. Headlamp on. Check the notebook from the day before. Make coffee on the camp stove. Sit with the coffee. Turn on the radio for 30 minutes to catch whatever the AM station was broadcasting. Write down anything relevant. The radio station was still going, but the quality was deteriorating. Sometimes they went silent for hours between broadcasts, and the things they said became more sparse and carefully chosen as the days went on. Breakfast. Oatmeal with whatever I had to add flavor. I had dried fruit, some sugar, some instant coffee mixed in for caffeine. Not delicious. Filling. Morning activity, maintenance. Check water levels. Clean whatever needed cleaning. Maintain equipment. Review fortifications. Make notes on anything I'd heard overnight. Afternoon. One of the harder parts of the day, the long middle hours with nothing requiring my attention. I'd brought a bag of books down from upstairs, thrillers mostly, some history, a couple of technical manuals I'd had in the garage. I read through the afternoon. I did push-ups and sit-ups because staying physically capable felt important, and because it ate up time. I did stretches, I thought. Evening. Food. Dinner was more substantial than breakfast. Rice and beans. Canned soup sometimes. Occasionally, one of the canned meats mixed with rice. I got creative with the spices, because the spices were truly the difference between eating and eating well, such as well meant anything in this context. Night radio if there was anything to hear. Reading by headlamp. Sleep. That was the rhythm. Days moved through it. They blurred together in ways that were different from how days blur when you're busy. Busy days blur because you don't notice them passing. But these days blurred because each one looked like the last. The sameness was its own kind of psychological weight, different from fear, but not lighter. Day 51. Something woke me up at around 2 in the morning. I came out of sleep fast, the way I came out of sleep when a load shifted behind me on a long haul and the truck started to feel wrong. Immediately awake, immediately cataloging. Sound. From above me. The first floor. Footsteps. Slow, irregular, uneven. Not Glenn. Glenn knew not to come to the house. We'd agreed we'd communicate through the fence only. Not my parents. They were 20 minutes away and had no way to reach me without a vehicle and without power. Not anyone I could explain with a reasonable assumption. I sat up on the sleeping pad with a headlamp in my hand, not turning it on. Compound bow beside me. I put my hand on it. The footsteps moved across what I estimated was the kitchen based on the floor plan. Slow, stopping, starting. The particular hesitancy of something moving through a space without purpose, just moving. I had the basement door locked. Solid deadbolt, reinforced frame, 2x4 drop bar. If something was on the first floor, it would have to get through that door to reach me. And that door was not getting opened quickly or quietly. I sat in the dark for 40 minutes, listening to the footsteps above me. They moved through the kitchen. They moved into what I thought was the living room. They moved back. They stopped for long stretches. Then they stopped completely. Then, impact. Something hitting the first floor from above, a crashing sound that I placed roughly over the bathroom area. Then silence. The footsteps didn't start again. I sat there until dawn light started to gray the gap under the basement door. Then I lay back down with the bow across my chest and didn't sleep. In the morning, I turned on the radio, and the hand crank sounded louder than usual in the silence, and I turned it down immediately. The first floor above me stayed silent. I spent 2 days trying to figure out if it was clear before I went up to investigate. I needed to know if my first floor fortifications had been breached. A breach on the first floor changed my situation significantly. It meant the basement was the only safe space, and I needed to account for that. I crept up the basement stairs on the third morning with the machete out and the bow across my back, unlocked the basement door, cracked it an inch. Kitchen, clear. Moved through the ground floor slowly. The living room, the hallway, the front room with its boarded windows, found it in the bathroom. Something had come in through the bathroom exhaust vent. Woman, from what I could tell. Maybe 40 years old, in what was left of a floral shirt. She'd come through the exhaust vent in the ceiling, which I had genuinely never thought about as a point of entry. Not because she'd planned it, but because the vent cap had rotted out at some point, and the housing was larger than it looked from outside. She'd fallen through the ceiling onto the bathroom floor when the housing gave way. She was dead on the floor, not moving. From the injuries she'd sustained in the fall, she would have died on impact or close to it. I stood in the bathroom doorway for a long time. I don't know who she was. I don't know how she'd gotten onto the roof in the first place. Probably climbed something nearby. A tree, maybe, following noise or movement. She'd wandered onto the roof and found the vent, and the vent had given way, and she'd fallen into my bathroom and died on my floor. I had to deal with that. I won't describe the process in detail. I'll say that it took about an hour and involved the heavy-duty trash bags I'd bought for exactly these kinds of situations, and I put her in the corner of the garage where I didn't have to see her, and I patched the vent housing from below with sheet metal and screws and duct tape. 3 layers. Then I went back to the basement and sat on my sleeping pad, and didn't move for most of the rest of the day. Day 58. The AM radio station went silent for 3 days straight, and then came back. Different. Different voice, different cadence. A man's voice, flat and tired, just reading location information. Areas confirmed clear. Areas confirmed compromised. Areas unknown. Columbus was under the Areas Unknown header, which told me that the people doing the broadcasting didn't have good information about what was happening here, which was either reassuring or terrifying, depending on how you thought about it. The voice also read out, once, in the same flat cadence as the location updates. If you are sheltered in place and are able to transmit, frequency 7.285 megahertz is being monitored by volunteer emergency coordinators. If you have a radio capable of transmitting on shortwave, check in. I didn't have a shortwave transmitter. I had a receiver. I couldn't respond. But I tuned to 7.285 and listened for 2 hours. There were voices, broken, interrupted, fading in and out. People in other cities, people in rural areas, someone who said they were in a farmhouse in central Indiana with about a month of supplies, and 3 other people. And they were asking if anyone knew about a safe zone near Fort Wayne. Someone in what sounded like it could have been Cleveland, reporting that a section of the east side was being cleared by what they described as military or former military, not official, maybe 15 people. Someone who just repeated a name, a woman's name, over and over in a way that suggested they'd been doing it for a long time and hadn't been answered. I turned the dial back to AM and listened to the flat voice reading locations until I fell asleep. Day 63. Glenn came to the fence and knocked the pattern, and his voice when he spoke had something in it I hadn't heard before. Not fear exactly. More like the particular tight quality of someone reporting bad news. He said his daughter from Michigan had made it. She'd driven down. She'd gotten through somehow, and she was with him now. Her name was Claire. She'd brought her son, who was 9, named Dylan. 3 of them in Glenn's house now. This was good news. Glenn's voice didn't sound like good news. I asked what was wrong. He said Claire had been on the road for 6 days. He said some of what she'd seen on the road was... He paused. He said it was bad. He said it in a way that said he wasn't going to describe it, and I understood. I said, "What do they need?" He said they were okay on food because Claire had brought some with her. But the boy was not sleeping. He kept waking up and crying, and Glenn didn't know what to do. He said it like he felt helpless about it, which I think he did. I didn't have anything useful to offer about a 9-year-old not sleeping. But I had a deck of playing cards in my kitchen junk drawer, and I pushed it through the gap under the fence the next morning, along with a notepad and some pencils and a bag of hard candy I'd bought almost as an afterthought on one of my last supply runs. Glenn knocked the pattern later that afternoon. Talksjakim said thank you. Day 68. I heard a vehicle. Not moving, idling, somewhere on my street or close to it. Engine sound, a light truck maybe, idling at low RPM. I went to the observation window and peeled the plastic back. A pickup truck, dark blue, maybe a Tacoma, was stopped in the middle of my street. 2 people in the cab, windows up. The truck was just sitting there, engine running, nobody getting out. On my street, there were 12 or so of the shuffling people in my line of sight, not many for recent days, and they were all orienting toward the truck. The engine was pulling them. 3 of them pressed against the passenger side door, others closing from down the block. The truck sat there for maybe 5 minutes. Then it started moving, slow, west on my street, and the things on my street followed the sound, shuffling after it. The truck maintained about 10-15 miles per hour. Fast enough to stay ahead without revving the engine, slow enough to stay controlled on a road littered with abandoned cars and debris. Pulling the crowd away. I watched until the truck turned the corner and disappeared. The cluster on my street thinned out following it. Within 20 minutes, my street was quieter than it had been in days. I don't know who was in that truck. I don't know if they did that on purpose or if they were just passing through and happened to draw attention. But the result was the quietest night I'd had since day 30. I wrote in my notebook, truck, dark blue, possibly Tacoma, intentional or accidental crowd clear, 2 occupants. Then under it, I wrote, are there organized people doing this? And circled it. Day 71. I ate the last of the canned tuna. This shouldn't have been notable. I had plenty of other food. But it signaled something. The variety phase was ending. The canned goods were rotating through, and I was into the parts of the inventory that I hadn't been excited about, even when buying them. The hominy made its first appearance. The beets were next. But there was something else. I'd been rationing rice and beans without intending to. I'd been eating other things first because they were more familiar, and I'd been slow to shift into a pure dry goods diet. Now the dry goods were going to be the diet. Rice and beans, oatmeal, pasta, peanut butter. Everything else was accent and supplement. This was fine. It was the plan. It was the plan I'd made in week 1 with Kevin's input, and it was a good plan, and I was not going to be hungry. But there's a difference between planning for something and arriving at it. I sat with that for a while. I made rice and beans that night with cumin and garlic powder and black pepper and some hot sauce I'd found in the back of a cabinet that I'd missed on my initial inventory. The hot sauce improved everything. I rationed it carefully. Day 74. Something happened that I've thought about a lot since. I was at the observation window in the early afternoon, and I noticed a man standing across the street. Not shuffling. Not moving in the disoriented, aimless way. Standing. Just standing, looking at the row of houses. He was maybe 50, heavy coat, backpack, a wooden-handled axe in his right hand. He stood there for about 3 minutes. Then he walked to the front door of the house directly across the street, which I knew had been unoccupied. The family had left on day 31 that I'd seen. And he tried the door. Locked. He put his shoulder into it twice, and it didn't open. He moved to the window, tried the window, found it locked. He looked at the axe handle in his hand, and then looked around the street, and then he didn't swing. He moved to the next house and tried that door. Same. He was working the block methodically. I stood at the window watching. The calculation I was running in my head. He's alive. He's uninfected. He's looking for shelter. If he comes to my door and knocks, I have to decide what to do. If he comes to my door with the axe and doesn't knock, I have to decide very quickly what to do. He worked 3 houses down the block and didn't get into any of them. He stood in the middle of the street and looked at both sides. Then he looked at my house. My house looked like the others. Boarded windows, dark. The sign on the front door that said, "Nothing here." Not worth it. He looked at my house for a long time. Then he walked away, heading north, the axe loose in his hand, stood at the window after he was gone. I thought about the calculation I'd run, the decision I'd been making without fully deciding. The man was alive and cold, and clearly hadn't slept in a bed in a while, and I had food in my basement, and I'd watched him walk away, and I hadn't stopped him. I still don't know if that was the right call. The right call. What does that even mean here? There's no right. There's just what you can live with and what you can't. I went back to the basement and wrote in the notebook, man, approximately 50, heavy coat, blue backpack, wooden-handled axe, heading north. Then I wrote, did not engage. Then I sat there for a while before I wrote anything else. Day 78. Glenn told me, through the fence, that Claire had been watching from an upstairs window the previous night and had seen a fire, southeast, several miles away. Big fire, burning for hours. She couldn't tell if it was structural or if it was deliberate, controlled burn or accident or something else. Fire in a city that isn't being maintained is different from fire when there's a fire department. It spreads until it runs out of things to burn. If it had caught a neighborhood southeast of us and wine conditions were wrong, it could reach us. Not in a day, but eventually. A neighborhood full of abandoned houses is dry kindling. I added fire to the things I was tracking. I started checking wind direction in my evening observations. Smell is a reliable early indicator for fire at distance. You can smell smoke long before you can see it, and the direction tells you something. I also made a fire exit plan. It had been a gap in my prep that I hadn't fully thought through. If the house became unsafe due to fire, I needed to move fast with the essentials. I packed a go bag that lived at the bottom of the basement stairs. 3 days of food, all my water purification supplies, first aid kit, my most important tools, notebook, radio, extra batteries. The go bag weighed about 40 pounds, and I could run with it. Not comfortably, but I could run. The truck in the garage was loaded with the larger supplies. If I had more time, I could load the truck. If I didn't have more time, I had the bag. Day 83. The water main broke. I'd been checking pressure every morning by turning the basement tap on briefly. For the past week, the pressure had been dropping steadily. On day 83, the tap produced a trickle, and then nothing. I turned it off. Sat with the new reality for a minute. I had my stored water. 100 gallons, roughly, give or take what I'd already used. I'd been careful with it. I was down to about 85 gallons, I estimated. At the rate I was using it for drinking, cooking, basic hygiene, I could stretch that to about 100 days. More if I was disciplined. The toilet would be a problem. I'd been using the flush assist bucket method, which required water. I switched to a different system I'd thought about and set up, a portable camping toilet with waste bags that could be sealed and stored. Not pleasant, functional. I moved it into the far corner of the basement. Rain was my backup water source. October had been dry. The long-range pattern I'd been noting suggested November would be wet. If it rained, I could collect from the gutters into the barrel outside and then filter through the Berkey. That was the plan. The plan for the water was now more dependent on weather than I would have liked. But it was a plan. Day 87. It rained. Not a lot, but it rained for about 6 hours overnight and into the morning. I went out at the point when precipitation is heaviest, and there's enough noise cover from rain hitting everything. The pattering of it on leaves and boards and metal and concrete that fills the acoustic landscape and makes my own movements unremarkable. I was outside for 12 minutes. I filled both 5-gallon jugs from the overflow of the barrel, which had collected beautifully. I was back inside and dripping in the kitchen before I saw anything move. Rain days are the safest days for outside movement. I noted that clearly in the notebook. Glenn reported the same from his side. He'd done a run out to the garage to get tools and had found it much easier than his previous attempts. Claire had started taking note of the weather pattern too. They were developing their own operational rules on their side of the fence. Day 90, 3 months. I marked it in the notebook with a circle. I don't know why. Marking it felt important, even though it was an arbitrary number in a situation where all the numbers were arbitrary. I did an inventory audit. I'd used roughly 10% of my food stores, which was better than I'd feared. The oatmeal was going faster than the rice, because oatmeal is easier to prepare at breakfast. The canned goods were nearly gone. I'd been using them as a supplement to the dry goods for variety. What remained was primarily the dry staples. I calculated, at my current rate, 60 to 70 days of food remaining. That was a number I didn't sit with comfortably. I called it a resource problem and started treating it like one. I cut my portion sizes by about 15%. Not enough to cause actual calorie deficit impact in the short term, but enough to extend my runway. I started keeping a daily log of exactly what I ate and the approximate calorie count. Obsessive maybe, but it gave me concrete information. The other option, the one I'd been avoiding thinking about directly, was a supply run outside. Not to Glenn's, outside the perimeter, to find more food. Day 94. I started planning the supply run. The closest supermarket to my house was a Kroger about 6 blocks northeast, which was a distance I could move on foot in about 15 minutes under normal conditions. Under current conditions, accounting for obstacles, pace, sound discipline, and anything I might encounter, I estimated 30 to 45 minutes one way. I had no idea what state the store was in. Depending on how early people had started hitting it, it could be stripped clean. The practical reality of most supermarket raids and disaster situations is that people take the obvious things first: bread, water, packaged snacks, and leave the harder-to-use things behind. Rice, dry beans, flour, things that require preparation, things that require knowing how to cook with basic ingredients. I was betting on those things being there. I'd been a truck driver. I'd seen the back end of freight distribution. I knew how much product a store like that cycles through and how much sits in the back room versus the shelf floor. Storeroom inventory was potentially significant. I spent 3 days on the planning. Route, through my backyard gate, north along the alley behind my block, then cut east on the parallel street and north again to avoid the heavier foot traffic I'd observed on my own street. More circuitous, but quieter. Timing, early morning, roughly 40 minutes after first light. Enough light to see clearly, not enough accumulated day heat to have the streets active. What to carry in? Go bag for supplies. 2 additional empty backpacks, 2 extra canvas tote bags. A tote bag makes no noise and can carry 40 pounds of canned goods if you're willing to hurt your shoulder. And what to wear? Same as before. Dark clothes, covered neck, gloves, boots. Weapons. Machete on the belt. Bow on the back. I'd been practicing drawing the bow silently, removing it from the shoulder, knocking an arrow, drawing. And I could do it in about 6 seconds. Not fast, but adequate, if I saw something coming. Sound discipline. Soft-soled shoes, inside boots for quieter movement. No loose gear, no jingling, everything secured. Communication. Glenn knew the plan. He'd be monitoring from his upstairs window, which had a line of sight to the eastern end of my street. If he saw something significant moving toward the route I'd told him I was taking, he'd ring the cowbell. Yes, cowbell. It was in his garage, and it was loud and distinctive. 3 times. I'd hear it from 6 blocks away if the streets were quiet. I went over the plan 3 times and changed small things twice. Then I decided it was as good as it was going to get. Day 97, the morning of the supply run. I got up an hour before dawn, ate a full portion of oatmeal because you don't go out on empty, loaded the bags, checked the machete edge, I'd been maintaining the blade, and it was good. Checked the bow, counted the arrows. 41. I took 30 in a quiver on the back, left 11 in the basement as reserve. I sat at the basement stairs and breathed for a few minutes. The thing about being scared in a situation like this is that being scared is the correct response. It's not irrational. The fear is accurate information. The fear says, the environment you are about to enter will kill you if you make significant errors. That's true. The fear is not something to overcome by pretending it isn't there. You work with it. You use it to sharpen your attention. Glenn knocked the pattern at the fence before I went out. 3 slow, 2 fast. I went to the back door and cracked it. Glenn, in a low voice through the gap. Street looks clear. Wind out of the north. Good luck. I went. The alley behind my block was dark and smelled like everything that happens when trash stops being collected for 3 months. I moved along it close to the fence line, watching both directions. Nothing moved in the alley. The cross street was harder. I waited at the corner for 2 minutes before crossing. A slow shape far to the west, but it was moving away. I crossed. The parallel street heading north was the worst of the route. More open, fewer natural barriers. I moved along the sidewalk close to the building faces, stopping at every cross street to listen before committing to a crossing. 4 blocks in, I heard something from the east, about a block away. That labored breathing sound that's not quite breathing, more of a throaty sound that I'd learned to identify as infected movement. Moving south, away from me. I pressed against a brick wall and waited. It passed the cross street without turning. I continued north. The Kroger came into view at block 6. The front entrance was a mess. Shopping carts overturned in the parking lot, glass from the automatic doors broken out, debris. I went around to the side, to the loading dock area, which I knew from experience would have a metal roll-up door and a regular entry door beside it. The regular entry door was unlocked. Not open, just unlocked, either because someone had left it that way or someone had picked the lock, though it wasn't that kind of lock. I went in. The store was dark. I had the headlamp, but I didn't turn it on yet. I stood just inside the door and listened. Smell. The dairy case, even dead and dark, was putting out something that I stepped away from quickly. The meat section would be the same or worse. I stayed away from both sections of the store and breathed through my mouth. I heard nothing inside. Waited 30 seconds. Nothing. I turned on the headlamp, red light mode. I'd gotten a headlamp with a red light setting specifically for situations like this, because red light doesn't carry as far through gaps and cracks and is less visible from outside. The middle aisles were stripped in the ways I'd predicted. The pasta aisle was largely gone. The canned soup section was down to about 30% of normal inventory. Bottled water, completely bare. But the rice section, which in a grocery store is usually a half aisle, still had maybe 40 bags of various sizes. People had taken some, but not all, because rice requires time and preparation, and a lot of people in an emergency grab things they can eat immediately. The bean section was similar. A lot of the quick-serve canned beans were gone, but dried bagged beans, multiple varieties, were largely intact. The baking aisle. Flour was mostly taken, but I found 4 5-pound bags of bread flour behind a displaced shelf unit that had probably been blocking them. Sugar, about 8 bags remaining. Salt, plentiful. Nobody panic buys salt, apparently. Back storage. This was the find. The back room of a Kroger is a different world from the store floor. Cases of product waiting to be shelved. Cases of canned goods I couldn't see from the sales floor. I spent 20 minutes in the back room with my headlamp and a flat cart that I found near the roll-up door, loading it with what I needed. Canned tomatoes, 12 cases. Canned chicken, 8 cases. Canned corn, 6 cases. Canned beans, 10 cases. Canned fish, multiple varieties, 4 cases. Evaporated milk, 3 cases. Vegetable oil, 6-gallon containers. Peanut butter, 16 large containers. Crackers, 12 boxes. Coffee, 8 large cans. The coffee made me almost laugh. The relief of it was disproportionate to its practical importance. I also found, in a corner of the back room, a full case of protein powder, chocolate flavor. This was not part of my planned list, and I stood there holding one of the tubs trying to decide if I had space. I made space. Protein powder is dense calories, and I was about to be fighting a calorie deficit. I took the whole case. I loaded what I could carry. 2 backpacks fully loaded, both tote bags full, the go bag about half full. I was carrying roughly 130 pounds of supplies total, more than I wanted to be carrying through 6 blocks of compromised city streets. I did the math. I could either leave some here and come back for it, or I could make one heavy trip. One heavy trip was faster and kept my exposure to a single event. But 130 pounds plus my weapons was going to slow me down significantly. I left a cache in the back room, the second load of supplies I hadn't been able to take, covered with a cardboard box and pushed against the wall where it wasn't immediately visible. Then I left the same way I'd come in. The return trip was harder. The weight changed my gait, changed my pace, changed my center of gravity. I moved more slowly. I was louder than I wanted to be. Not loud, but louder than the forward trip. At the 4th block south, I walked into a problem. There were 3 of them in the cross street I needed to use. Not moving together with any purpose, just there, occupying the space. 2 on the north side of the cross street, 1 drifting east. I stopped at the corner and watched. The 1 drifting east would clear the cross street in about 3 minutes if it kept its current heading. The 2 on the north side were moving very slowly, but generally east, which would eventually take them out of my path. I had time. I stayed where I was, breathing slowly, heavy bags cutting into my shoulders, and I waited 5 minutes. The drifting one had cleared. The 2 on the north side were far enough east that I had a clean crossing if I moved immediately. I crossed. The sound of my boot on the pavement, slightly harder than I'd intended, a heel contact that wasn't quite silent, was enough. The further of the 2 turned toward it. I was already across the street. I pressed against the building face. The thing that had turned stood still, oriented toward where the sound had come from, which was behind it now. It didn't adjust. It stood oriented toward a sound that had already moved on. I held absolutely still for 90 seconds. It turned back to its previous direction. I moved on. Back inside the house. Gear off, machete back on the wall bracket, bow back on its hook. I sat on the kitchen floor, first floor still in my boots, breathing. 15 minutes of sitting. Then I carried everything to the basement and sorted it. New inventory written into the notebook. Calorie estimates revised upward. The food problem had another 3 months on its timeline, minimum, with careful rationing. I ate lunch, rice with canned chicken and cumin, sitting on the sleeping pad in the basement. It was the best meal I'd had in weeks. Not because it tasted better, but because the sitting on the floor breathing that preceded it had made the normalcy of eating into something else. Glenn knocked the pattern that afternoon. I went to the fence, he said. Saw you go out. Wasn't sure when you'd come back. Glad you're back. I said, me too. He said Claire had watched from the window and hadn't seen anything close to my route. I told him about the Kroger, about the cash in the back room, about what was still there. He said he'd been thinking about his own supply situation and wondering about a run. I told him the window when it rained. I told him about the route, the timing, the red headlamp, the back door. I told him what I'd found and what was still there. Then I told him, if you go, let me go with you. Glenn said, I thought you'd say that. Day 102. Glenn and I did a joint run. Claire came to the fence while we were prepping and said she wanted to help carry. Glenn said no immediately. He had Dylan to watch. The house needed someone in it. She pushed back. They had a muted version of an argument through the fence boards. Me standing there awkwardly with a loaded pack. Eventually, Claire accepted staying with Dylan on the condition that Glenn took the radio with him. The small portable unit, tuned to the frequency they agreed on, so she could reach him if something went wrong at the house. Glenn took the radio. We went through the alley together, two people, which felt different from going alone. Not necessarily safer in all ways. Two people make more noise than one. But psychologically different. Having someone at your back who you trust changes how your nervous system handles the constant low-grade threat input. Glenn was good outside. He moved carefully and without hesitation, the way experienced men move in situations they've decided not to be rattled by. He'd been an electrician for 30 years, which means he's spent his career making decisions under time pressure in environments where mistakes have consequences. That translated. The Kroger backroom had not been touched since my previous trip. The cash was exactly where I'd left it. We loaded Glenn's bags and mine. He'd brought 3 good military-style pack straps and moved through the store systematically for another 30 minutes, taking things I hadn't gotten the first time. Matches, candles, a full first aid restock, 3 boxes of cold medicine and cough syrup that I'd been wanting for weeks, ibuprofen in large quantities, batteries, several boxes of various sizes, and, behind the pharmacy counter in the back, which Glenn thought to check and I hadn't, a locked cabinet that Glenn opened with a flathead screwdriver and a minute of patient work. The locked cabinet had prescription medication samples and a relatively small quantity of actual dispensed medications that had never been picked up. I looked at the medication names. Some I recognized, most I didn't. I took everything. If Kevin were here, he'd know what everything was. He'd spent time learning about medications as part of his preparedness research. For now, I took it all, and we'd sort it out. We also took a blood pressure kit and a basic wound care kit and some saline eye wash that was behind the counter, because infections are the thing that kills you when hospitals aren't available. Glenn found chocolate, a full rack of it in the pharmacy section, the kind of chocolate that sits behind the counter in small convenience-type displays. He loaded half of it into a side pocket of his pack without looking at me. I didn't say anything. Some things you don't negotiate. The return trip was heavier for both of us. We moved slower. 2 blocks from the house, we hit a cluster. 5 of them moving north along the parallel street in a loose group. We waited in a doorway for 6 minutes while they cleared. Glenn was breathing hard, but steadily. Not panic breathing, working breathing. When it was clear, we moved. Back to the alley. Through the back gate. Glenn went through the hole in the fence between our yards that we'd made on week 2, a gap between 2 boards we'd never announced to anyone else. Into his yard. I went on to mine, through my back door, lock it. Then a thing happened that surprised me. I was sitting on the basement stairs sorting the supplies, and I started laughing. Quietly, I was always quiet, but laughing. It came up from somewhere, and I laughed into the back of my hand for about a minute. Not because anything was funny, because we'd done it. Because Glenn had put chocolate in his pack without asking. Because the pharmacy cabinet had opened with a flathead screwdriver. Because being alive, honestly, genuinely felt good sometimes, even in the middle of all this. That surprised me, and I wrote it in the notebook, surprised by good feeling, unexpected. Keep this. Day 110. Something changed on the street. The density of infected moving through the neighborhood had been slowly decreasing over the past few weeks. I'd noted it, but hadn't wanted to read too much into it. At day 67, there'd been maybe 40 or 50 visible from my observation window on any given morning. By day 90, that was down to maybe 15 to 20. By day 110, I was seeing 4 to 8. Where were they going? The radio had said weeks earlier that there was evidence of infected individuals following larger sound sources, vehicles, power generators, anything louder than the ambient environment. If organized survivors somewhere in the city or beyond were using sound to draw and relocate infected groups, that could explain the declining density. Or they were simply diffusing outward from population centers as the initial surge of stimulus ran out. Or there was a third option that I thought about but didn't want to write down. The third option was that there was less food for them, meaning fewer living people to follow, which meant the living were running out or going elsewhere. I didn't write that down. I wrote, density declining. Monitor. Day 115. Glenn knocked on the fence in the afternoon, and his voice was different. He said, "Claire's sick." I asked what kind of sick. He said she'd woken up with a fever, stomach problems, vomiting. He didn't think. He paused. He said he didn't think it was that. She hadn't been outside except once, weeks ago, and she'd been careful. He thought it was something she'd eaten, or a regular virus, or the stress of everything catching up to her physically. I went through the medications we'd gotten from the pharmacy. I passed things through the fence gap. Pepto-Bismol, electrolyte packets, I'd had some in my camping supplies, ibuprofen, and a couple of packs of the crackers that were the blandest thing I had. Also the blood pressure kit, which I wasn't sure was relevant, but Glenn had mentioned Claire complaining of headaches, and it seemed like the right thing to have available. Glenn took everything through the gap without saying much. I stayed near the fence for a while. I could hear Dylan through Glenn's back window, talking to himself or to an action figure in the quiet, focused way kids talk when they're deep in play. That sound, a 9-year-old at normal volume, talking to a toy, was the most ordinary thing I'd heard in months. Day 118. Claire was better. Whatever it had been, it passed. Glenn reported through the fence with a particular release in his voice of a man who had spent 3 days afraid of what it might be. I did a full account of my food situation that day, with what I'd brought back from the 2 Kroger runs and what I'd started with. Approximately 160 days at current reduced rations. That was my number. 5.5 months, more or less. I also had a supply problem I'd been ignoring. Fuel for the camp stove. I had 8 propane canisters remaining of the original stock, plus I'd found 4 more in the Kroger. 12 canisters at roughly an hour of cooking time each. I was cooking twice a day, roughly 30 minutes per cooking session. Total, maybe 12 days of fuel at current usage. I needed to change how I was cooking, or I needed more fuel. I switched to cooking once per day and preparing 2 meals at once. Rice and beans cooked in a large batch in the morning, eaten over the day. That cut my fuel use in half immediately. The longer-term solution was a different heat source. I'd been avoiding the fireplace upstairs. It was an actual wood-burning fireplace in the living room, which in my house was boarded up and out of my primary use zone. Because smoke from a chimney was a visibility indicator. Anyone moving through the neighborhood, infected or living, could see chimney smoke. But there was also the question of how cold November was getting. The basement was insulated but not heated. And Ohio in November gets cold enough that 60 degrees in the basement at night was the warm option. 40 degrees was possible in a cold snap. I made a judgment call. I moved back to using the fireplace on cold nights. The overnight hours, roughly midnight to 5 a.m., when the smoke would be less visible against a dark sky and when ambient temperature was coldest. I'd checked the flue before boarding the room, and it was clear. I had wood in the garage, half a cord I'd bought the previous winter for exactly one cozy fire, and then never gotten around to using. The first night I lit the fireplace, I sat in the living room, the first time I'd been in there properly in months, and watched the fire. Just watched it. The wood had been dry enough that it caught quickly and burned hot. The room got warm. The warm got into my back and shoulders in a way I'd forgotten warmth could. I put it out around 4:30 a.m. and sealed the flue damper and went back to the basement. But I sat there until 4:20. I wasn't asleep. I just sat there, warm in the dark except for the fire, and let the warmth be a thing. Day 125. I found a dog. Not found like I was looking for one. Found like I heard something scratching at the back door in the early morning and cracked it open expecting I didn't know what, and a dog was standing there. Medium-sized, maybe 40 pounds. Some kind of shepherd mix with a brown and black coat. Collar, but no tags. Thin, ribs visible, but not injured. Standing there looking up at me with the direct serious expression that dogs have, that I have found a person expression. I let it in. This was not in the plan. This was not strategic. The dog came in, and I fed it canned corn because it was the first thing I could open, and I was standing there with a can opener before I'd made a conscious decision to feed it. The dog ate the corn like it had been considering food theoretically for some time. Then it lay down on the concrete floor next to my sleeping pad and put its head on its front paws. I sat on the sleeping pad and looked at the dog. The dog looked at me. I named it Ford, not after anyone in particular. Just a name that came out when I said, "Okay, Ford, what are we doing here?" Ford lived in the basement with me. He changed things in ways I could describe practically. An early warning system, another set of alert senses, a reason to keep a consistent schedule. But the practical description isn't really the point. The point is that I'd been alone in a basement for almost 4 months, and then there was a dog in it, and Ford did not understand why there was no other option and just slept next to me anyway. Day 130. Tried the shortwave frequency again on the good receiver I had. Day 130 was a clear, cold night, and shortwave carries differently in cold weather, further and with less interference sometimes. I spent 2 hours listening. Heard a voice I hadn't heard before. Clearer than most, with what sounded like actual radio equipment rather than a repurposed unit. A man's voice, deliberate, steady. He was giving a position, north-central Ohio, he said, on a farm property outside a town called Galion, which I knew was about an hour north of Columbus. He said, "We have 12 people here. We have water and food sufficient for approximately 6 more months if we take on no additional people. We are accepting survivors. If you can hear this, and you are in Ohio, and you can travel, the route is as follows." He gave highway numbers. Route 23 north out of Columbus, then 95 west toward Galion. Specific intersections. A landmark, a grain elevator with a blue roof that was visible from the road. He repeated it twice and then signed off. I sat in the dark with the receiver warm in my hands. 12 people, a farm, 6 months of food. And a question underneath that. Was this real? Was this a functional settlement or a trap or wishful thinking or something worse? The history of disaster situations includes people broadcasting false safe havens for reasons I didn't want to think about with a full stomach. But it also included real places, real groups of people who had managed to consolidate and survive and were reaching out because reaching out made sense. I wrote down everything he'd said, word for word as best I could. Route 23 north, Route 95 west, grain elevator, blue roof. Then I sat with it. I had food, I had water. I had a working situation here in this basement, in this neighborhood, where I knew the rhythms, where Glenn was 15 feet away, where Ford slept with his head on my knee. But I had 160 days of food, 5.5 months. And after that, the number at the end of 5.5 months was 0. And 0, on my own, was a different kind of problem. Day 133. Glenn and I had a long conversation through the fence, the longest we'd had. I told him about the radio broadcast. I told him everything, the position, the farm, the numbers, the route. I told him I was thinking about it. He listened. Glenn always listens before he talks. After I was done, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Claire's been talking about the same thing. Moving. She thinks staying put eventually runs out." I said, "Yeah, that's the math." He said, "The boy, Dylan, we can't. Whatever we do, Dylan's what matters." I said I understood. He said, "The truck, my truck. Could it get us all there with supplies?" I said yes, it could. I had fuel for it. The ram with the loaded beds could carry 6 people and a significant load of supplies. For 1 hour of driving, less than that, 45 minutes maybe, to a farm outside Galion, it would carry us fine. Glenn said, "How do we know it's real?" I said, "We don't. Not until we go." He said, "When?" I hadn't thought about when yet. I said, "We think about it more first. We wait for a clear day. We watch the streets and figure out a window. We don't rush this." He said, "Okay." He said he'd talk to Claire. Day 138. I did something I'd been putting off for 40 days and that I needed to do before any other decision. I drove to Westerville to check on my parents. Not a long trip, 20 minutes on a normal day. I took back roads, watching for what I'd mapped as the denser areas based on my radio monitoring and observation. Went out before dawn with Ford in the passenger seat. Ford was excellent in the truck. He sat up straight in the seat and watched everything. I couldn't tell if he was useful as an early warning system in the truck. The windows were up and the diesel was running. But he seemed to find the truck natural, like he'd done this before. Westerville was quieter than Columbus proper. The suburb had a lower density to begin with, smaller streets, more detached houses with bigger yards. I moved through it carefully, watching. There were infected, fewer than I had seen in my own neighborhood at any point, moving in that same aimless way. My parents' house. The lights were off. The car was in the driveway. I pulled in and sat for a minute watching. Then I knocked, our family's actual knock, the old one from when I was a kid. Something we'd done for decades. 3 quick, pause, 2 slow. The basement window curtain moved, then footsteps, then the basement door opening from inside, then the back door. My mother, my father, behind her. We stood there for a while. My mother hugging me, my father with his hand on my arm. Both of them older looking than they'd been 40 days ago, both of them visibly thinner, but alive and together and intact. I sat at their kitchen table and we talked for an hour. They'd been in the basement mostly. They'd run out of some things, bread, which they'd expected, some of the things I hadn't left enough of. But the main stores were holding. They were managing. My dad had rigged up a small wood stove situation in the basement that was, he admitted, not entirely safe, but had kept them warm. I refilled their water from the jugs I'd brought, left more food from the Kroger supplies, left extra candles and batteries. My dad walked me to the truck when I was ready to leave. He looked at the truck, at the fuel drums in the bed, at Ford sitting in the passenger seat, watching him through the windshield. He said, "You're thinking about leaving Columbus." I said, "Yeah." I told him about the radio broadcast, the farm outside Galion. He said, "You should go." I started to say something about them coming with me. He cut me off, which my father does not do. He said, "Ray, your mother and I have talked about this. We're not going anywhere. I can't put your mother in a truck and drive through that. She knows it, and I know it. But you should go. You've got people, and you've got supplies, and you're young enough to do it." I said, "I'm 46. He said, "Young enough." My mom was at the back door listening. She didn't say anything. She just had that look she gets. I said, "I'll come back for you when it's safer." He said, "Sure." He said it in the way my dad says things when he means something else. Not cynical. Just realistic. He's been alive long enough, and he knows himself well enough to know his own limits. I hugged him. He hugged back, which my dad does not do often. I drove back to Columbus with Ford sitting up straight and watching everything. Day 141. I told Glenn, "We go in 4 days." He said, "Okay." He said Claire was ready. He said Dylan had not been told why they were packing, but he was helping pack because Dylan was the kind of kid who wanted to help with things. We spent the next 3 days quietly consolidating. I loaded the Ram's bed strategically, heaviest items low and forward, fuel drums secure at the rear corners with chain tie downs, passenger space in the crew cab for 4 people and a dog. I calculated weight. Fully loaded with supplies, and 4 people I was looking at, about 4,000 pounds over factory spec for the truck bed. The Cummins would handle it. The suspension would complain. We'd go slow. I walked Glenn through the truck on day 143. Showed him the hand pump for the fuel, how to transfer if we needed to stop. Showed him the go bags and where they were and the logic of what was in them. Showed him the maps, actual paper maps that I'd had in the truck's glove box for years, because I'm the kind of driver who keeps paper maps. Glenn took the maps and studied them for about 20 minutes. He found Galion. He found Route 23 and Route 95. He said, 45 minutes from here, assuming roads are passable. I said, assuming. He said, we should have a backup plan if the route's blocked. I showed him the alternate routes I'd already mapped. He nodded and handed the maps back. Claire came to the fence that evening, her voice lower than Glenn's but clearer through the boards. She said, thank you for all of this. The coffee, the cards for Dylan, all of it. I didn't know what to say. I said, "You're welcome." Then I said, "We're going to get there." She said, "I know." Then she said, "Dylan wants Ford to sit next to him in the truck." I said Ford would probably prefer it. Day 145. Departure day. I was up at 3 in the morning. Did final checks. Loaded the last items. Made coffee on the camp stove. Last use of the stove. I left it in the basement as redundant stock for whoever might someday use this house. And drank it standing in the kitchen in the dark. Ford sat at my feet. I walked through the house once. I don't know why exactly. Upstairs and down, by headlamp. The rooms I'd barely been in for months. The bedroom where I'd slept on the last normal night. The bathroom where I'd patched the vent housing. The living room with the fireplace. The kitchen with the old shipping manifest in the junk drawer that my list was written on. I pulled the list out of the drawer. The one I'd written on day 4 with the categories food, water, medical, tools, defense, communication, power, messy handwriting, coffee stained on one corner. I put it in my jacket pocket. Then I went to Glenn's side gate and knocked. 3 slow, 2 fast. Moving to Glenn's garage through the gap in the fence felt different in the early morning dark. Different from all the other times I'd gone through that gap. We loaded Glenn's supplies into the truck bed in the dark, quiet and methodical. Claire was moving smoothly and efficiently, handing things to Glenn, who handed things to me, who positioned them. Dylan was awake and silent with the specific alertness that children have when they understand something important is happening, even without knowing all of what it is. Ford moved in and out of their legs without getting in anyone's way. 4:30 a.m. Truck loaded, everyone ready. I pulled out of the garage with the headlights off and sat in the alley for 60 seconds with the engine at idle, listening. Glenn sat next to me in the passenger seat with the maps. Claire and Dylan in the back with Ford between them. I heard Dylan whisper something to Ford, and Ford made a small sound in response. I turned on the lights and drove. The first mile was the hardest. The streets were not empty. There were things in the road, debris, abandoned cars parked at strange angles, one whole intersection jammed with vehicles that had been there since day 1. I moved through and around them slowly, watching for movement. There was movement. Not much. In the first mile, I saw maybe 8 of them in the road or on the sidewalks. At my speed, about 12 miles per hour, slow and controlled. They didn't have time to close on the truck before I was past. 2 of them turned toward the sound and reached out, and I drove around them without stopping. Dylan said something in the back seat, his voice very small. Claire said something back, quiet. Glenn looked at the map. The second mile was better, a clearer street. Then onto Route 23, which was wider and had a more open sight line. And at 40 miles per hour, the infected that were present became non-issues. They were standing or shuffling in places, and we were past them before they could close distance. I pushed the speed up to 50 once we were past the outer ring of Columbus. The road was damaged in places, frost heaves and a winter's worth of uncleared debris. But it was passable. The Cummins was running steady, and the suspension complained exactly as I'd predicted, and I drove through it. Glenn had the map on his knee and the window cracked, watching road signs. He said, Route 95 in about 3 miles. He said it like he was co-piloting, which he was. Route 95 was clear. We turned west. The fuel drums in the back were full, and I watched the gauge out of habit, even though I knew we had range to spare. The sky ahead was starting to gray on the eastern edge. Early dawn. Dylan said something, and I half turned to look. He was looking out the passenger window at a field going by. Just a field, late November brown, open and flat and empty in the pre-dawn light. He said, to no one in particular, I forgot what fields looked like. No one answered him. There wasn't an answer that would have helped. I kept driving. The grain elevator appeared on the left side of Route 95, about 12 miles west of the junction. Blue roof, exactly as described, visible from 2 miles out. There was a gate across the driveway. A man standing at the gate in a heavy work coat with a rifle on his shoulder, watching us come. He didn't raise the rifle. He just watched. I stopped about 30 yards from the gate and put the window down. The man at the gate was maybe 35, red beard, no expression that I could read at that distance. He looked at the truck, at the people in it, at the fuel drums. He looked for a while. Then he said, loud enough to carry. How many? I said, 4 people and a dog. He said, how many are infected? I said, 0. We've been sealed up. He stood there for a moment. Then he turned back toward the farm property. I could see the farmhouse behind a line of trees, lights on, actual lights meaning they had power somehow. And he called out. Another person came from behind the gate. A woman, older, maybe my age, in overalls and boots. She looked at the truck too. She said, you the one who had the diesel drums? I said, yes. She said, we've been trying to find diesel for 2 months. Come in. The gate opened. I pulled the truck through. The farm was real. That was the first thing and the biggest thing. It was real. 14 people, not 12 as the broadcast had said. They'd taken in 2 more since. A working farm with solar panels on the barn roof and a well, and a root cellar full of vegetables and a smokehouse and chickens. An actual operating smallholding, run by a couple in their 60s, the woman in overalls, whose name was Bev, and her husband Walt, who had run it for 30 years before everything else and were still running it now, but with more people and more purpose. They took us in. They fed us, an actual meal, cooked on a wood stove, eggs and potatoes and bread that Bev had baked that morning. I sat at the table and ate it, and Ford sat at my feet and ate the scraps, and Dylan ate 2 full plates and looked like he might cry. Glenn sat across from me and looked around the farmhouse and then looked at me. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. Bev asked about the city, about what the roads had been like coming out, about what I'd observed in the months I'd been in the neighborhood. I told her. Walt was taking notes, an actual notebook, writing down road conditions and infected density by area. They were building a picture. They had people doing runs for specific supplies, and they used information like what I was giving them to plan routes. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like what I knew was useful. That's a specific feeling that I hadn't realized I'd been missing until it came back. I told Bev about the diesel in the truck, told her about the hand pump, told her it was fuel traded for shelter, however that math worked out. She said, that math works fine. I'm on the farm now. I don't know what day it is by my original count. I stopped counting days by the numbering system after we arrived. There are mornings and evenings and the kind of work that a farm requires that gives each day a natural structure independent of any number you'd attach to it. Glenn is here. Claire is here. Dylan is sleeping in a real bed for the first time in months and waking up to find chickens outside the window, which he finds deeply satisfying. Ford patrols the perimeter with a focus that suggests he was always meant to be a farm dog and simply hadn't gotten there yet. I'm driving again. Not a Peterbilt, not a freight route. But I've been out on runs twice with 2 of the farm crew using the Ram, recovering supplies from surrounding towns and farms. I know how to move through compromised roads. I know how to approach a location, how to assess it, when to go in and when to back off. 19 years of driving in bad conditions for a living turns out to have been preparation I didn't know I was making. My parents are still in Westerville. I called them on the radio system the farm has. Someone here had the foresight to set up a proper shortwave rig and got through twice. They're still there. My dad sounded like my dad. My mom asked if I was eating. I said yes. I was eating eggs and fresh bread and things that had grown in the ground. She said, "Good. The red marker map is still folded in my jacket pocket." Kevin's voice from that first phone call, "Water first, always," is still in my head. The list on the shipping manifest is still in my jacket pocket too. I take it out sometimes. Food, water, medical, tools, defense, communication, power. I got 30 days, and I used every one of them. I didn't know if it was going to matter. I made the list at the kitchen table, and I filled the barrels, and I reinforced the doors, and I had no idea if any of it was going to matter, because you can't know that before it matters. You prepare in the dark and find out later if the work held. The work held, not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough. And I'm still here. And Glenn is still here. And a 9-year-old kid is sleeping in a real bed with a dog at his feet. And Bev is making bread in the morning, and the smoke from the chimney goes straight up in cold air, because there's nobody trying to find us by the smoke anymore. For now, for right now, I'll take it.